So hi everyone. Today it's my pleasure to have Dr. Tsang here. Susan is obviously a bat scientist. She specializes in flying foxes, especially. She earned a PhD in ecology, evolution, and behavior in New York, and she's now a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History and at the National Museum of Philippines. She created in 2018 Biodiversity Global, which is her own scientific consultancy which provides expertise on natural resource management or research development, among other things. And now she's here today to talk to us about bat conservation in the context of COVID. So thank you, Susan, for coming. Really nice and really excited to hear about everything that has been going on with bats in this context, because it's been crazy. I'm really interested in bats in anyway, because they just harbor so many crazy patterns. But at the moment, everyone has been interested in bats, so very excited to hear about all of it. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to talk to everybody about bats today and really highlight some aspects about bats that people don't really appreciate, and then talk a little bit about how that relates to our current pandemic. So just as a quick primer to those who are not as familiar with bats, they are the only true flying mammal. Anything else that's like a flying mammal actually glides. And because they can fly, they can actually go into all these new spaces ecologically, and that leads to more speciation. And so there's over 1,400 species of bats in the world. That's 20% of all mammals. And the only other mammal that is more species richer than bats are rodents, which are about 25% of all mammals. And so we have this huge, unique group that is occupying, this space that we don't really think of normally as associated with mammals, but also just most people think of bats as these tiny little insect eaters. But the ones that I study are called flying foxes. They are non-echolocating. They are gigantic. Normally, if I were giving this talk like in person, I can show people that, a normal bat that most people think about is the size of their fist, but the bats that I study are about the size of your forearm. And they're found everywhere in Southeast Asia. They have a range that extends all the way out east into the Pacific Islands and down along the Indian Ocean into South Asia, into Madagascar. And these are a genus that is the most species rich in the family. So there's about 65 species out of the family of 200 for oval fruit bats. And there are some that are very widespread. So they're found in multiple places in Southeast Asia. And there are some that are really endemic. So like in different parts of the South Pacific, you have islands that singularly have their own species. And because of the fact that they are often endemic, they are highly threatened. And even in places where they're very widespread, there's a lot of persecution and hunting of the bat species. And because of that, they end up becoming unable to replace their pups in time. So, because bats only have one pup per year. And so it's not like with rodents, when people think about them, there's one individual adult and they have multiple offspring. Bats aren't really like that. And so they can't really replace any that are lost because of different kinds of threats that are facing them. They're very long-lived. If you look at the ones that we have in captivity, they are at least 15, 20 years old. And so we know that they can be even more long-lived. We know from other bats that there are genes that are related to having less senescence. And so they can go to as old as like 37 is the oldest bat that's been recorded. And it's a little insect bat. And they are really capable of doing long distance dispersal. So they're not really limited by these ocean barriers. They can actually cross them pretty easily. And it's only behaviorally, some of them don't really feel like it and basically stay only on that island. And they really seek out these dispersal routes by chasing down fruit resources and nectar resources, which are sometimes temporary in some landscapes. And that makes them really important as pollinators and seed dispersers, because sometimes they're the only animal that is able to take something that is that big. So on the lower right, you see them eating a fig there, but they also are eating other larger fruits, like with mangoes. They can actually carry the seed from one tree to another. They don't have to ingest it completely, and that still helps with seed dispersal. And that makes them really important keystone taxa, especially on a lot of these islands where they might be the only remaining medium-sized frugivore that is actually doing any of this. And you'll see that it's a really big deal, because it's not just providing ecosystem services in the sense of like provisions for people, in terms of food and it's actually a really important part of the cycle that goes on in an ecosystem. So any sort of your regulatory or your support types of ecosystem services like nutrient cycling or climate regulation or air and water purification has to do with the health of the forest itself, and that often has to go back to the health of the animals that support those particular processes for the trees. And then there's also just cultural significance often in bat species that are not appreciated fully because of the fact that there are different value systems across the world. In the South Pacific, for instance, there are species where they use the teeth of the flying foxes as currency. And then there's places that are also really interested in them as symbols of like health, basically. And so it depends on where you're looking at, and it really has to make us think about how our cultural perceptions in the West are often geared very much towards this negative way of thinking about bats. Whereas like, I'm also from like Chinese culture where we don't really have that kind of negative thinking of bats necessarily. And if you look in Southeast Asia, which is where I mostly work, there's actually a lot of evidence that shows that people really do value these services. When asked about this, this is a study that was done by Navjot Sodhi about 10 years ago now, more than 10 years ago now. And it looked at different places in Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. And if people, cared about those things, and you'll see that all those green bars are yes. So these are all different types of ecosystem services that are important to them. And a lot of these services are very much dependent on animals, not just bats, but bats do actually contribute to a lot of this too, and people don't seem to recognize that. And so while we're in the process of building intrinsic value for people for biodiversity, like making people like biodiversity just for being biodiversity, we need other short-term and medium-term ways to convince people to buy into protecting them. And in some cases that requires that you give them these other reasonings, like they provide these ecosystem services that are important to the economy, they are important culturally, and start really getting that idea planted in their head so that you can actually move forward with building more conservation efforts. And some of these ecologically important plants that bats are the seed dispersers or pollinators for include early successional plants like figs, as I mentioned before. So you need those plants to go out there and break down the soil and make it so that it's something that other plants can actually come in and then rebuild that forest. And you see this a lot on Pacific Islands where you have, volcanic eruptions, you have cyclones that will like wipe out an entire area. And that's really important also because the bats are flying across these spaces and then they're depositing seeds, so they form a seed bank that allows that forest regeneration also. So behaviorally, this is really significant, especially when you're looking at the fact that some birds don't like to cross places that are suboptimal, and they don't like to cross like oceans, but these bats don't particularly care. Flying foxes are pretty capable of flying across really, really long distances, to the point where we've recorded some flying fox colonies from Sumatra will cross over the Straits of Malacca to feed in Malaysia and then come back. So there's these flights that happen pretty regularly also. And if you look at the economic side, you actually have a lot of species of plants that are really important to the regional economy that actually are dependent on bats. And so people are really familiar with things like mango and durian, but there are also plants like kapok, which are, they have this little fibrous cottony thing, and people stuff furniture with it. They have petai, which is often eaten with a lot of food. There's these really giant bean-like things. And really, if you look at something like durian, it's really, really important to have bats because these are plants that are not able to self-pollinate. So you actually need an animal to bring the pollen from one tree to another. And these trees are not closely clustered together necessarily in the landscape. They are often like singular trees in a forest landscape that is fairly dispersed. And if you don't have the bat show up, then what happens is you can have a flower on the durian plant that will blossom, but then there'll be no fruit set. And so you actually do need to have that plant have that contact with a pollinator in order to cause it to be more effectively pollinated. And a student of mine who is Indonesian has worked on this in Sulawesi, and other folks have worked on this in Thailand and in Malaysia. So it's been shown to be something that is of critical importance to a lot of the economy in the region. If you look at the numbers that are coming out from Thailand, for instance, they know that durian is like $1 billion industry for them because they also actively human mediate farm them. So like they have farms where they will have people climb up the tree and like deposit certain types of pollen so they get certain types of cultivars. But you get that service for free from the bats for Indonesia, where they are just semi-wild. And so people just collect the durian as they fall off the tree. And so you can have a collapse of these industries if you don't have a stable ecosystem that is maintaining these, the health of these plants. And then this is the part that I'm sure everybody wants me to talk about, which is bats as natural reservoir hosts. And I want to just caveat this as I'm trying to give a very quick overview to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And so the first thing I want to do is have everybody understand the definitions of some terms. So natural reservoir host is usually like an organism that in nature, the pathogen lives in them and they're found in the natural environment. They just evolve together, you know, they're just there. And a pathogen can be anything that's a virus, a bacterium, or a microorganism that can cause a disease. And in this case, when we're talking about coronavirus, you know, we're talking about SARS-CoV-2. And then when the pathogen actually enters your body and multiplies, that's an infection. And when you have a pathogen that harms your body, that's the disease. So an infection by a pathogen doesn't necessarily lead to a disease. So like, you just have to be careful. And some people talk about like virulence in terms of how dangerous something is. And I might end up using the term zoonoses or zoonotic disease, which is an animal to human disease. And I just want to make sure that people are clear on that because we're going to be talking about bats as natural reservoir hosts. You know, it's an organism where the pathogen has lived in the bats, it's in the natural environment, and we don't have any sort of understanding, though, of what happens in nature with them. In particular, the group that I study, the flying foxes, have been this like, it's kind of been like the poster child for people trying to study emerging infectious diseases in the past 15 years, because most of the documented outbreaks recently in Australia, in Malaysia, and Bangladesh are for Nipah and Hendra virus, which are in the family Paramyxoviridae. And they kind of know that there are cases where the bats can transfer it directly to humans. So for instance, in Bangladesh, they were drinking out of these sap collecting cups that were attached to the trees, and the bats love sugar water, so they just come in, they drink it, they hang out on the tree right above it, and they defecate and urinate into it. And then when people take it and then they drink it, because the urine and the feces are ways in which the virus can be transmitted to people, then they ingest it. And so once somebody ingests it and it gets to be a strain that is actually effective at harming humans, and then they pass it on to somebody else, it starts becoming an outbreak. And in other cases, like in Malaysia, they know that there are farm animals that are intermediate hosts. So with Contagion, the movie where you saw like at the end, they showed a little fruit bat and they showed some pigs, and that's how Gwyneth Paltrow gets it and dies. Well, we kind of already knew that that was a real thing that happened in Malaysia, because they suspected that the bats were the natural reservoir host and that it got into some pigs, and then the pigs passed it on to people. And a lot of that isn't from the bats necessarily, you know, flying over the pigs and causing this to happen, but it's a lot of practices by people farming that are not great. And so it's like letting the pigs out into the forest, and it happens to coincide with the season when bats are also really immunologically compromised because they just gave birth. And then the pigs, you know, overlap with the bats in terms of accessing the blood and stuff by eating placenta and things like that. So all of these are not just like the bats have it, it's just the bats have it and then something else happened related to people or human activity that creates this interface for them to then be able to transmit a virus to us. And these are all viruses that are in NIH category C. So as an American, for us, that means that there are 3 categories in NIH, A, B, and C is kind of like lower than the other 2, but that would include things like coronavirus. So when I'm studying things like Nipah and Hendra, it fits in that same framework of trying to understand how emerging infectious diseases actually operate and how they are found in nature and then how they can infect us. But a lot of that work is pretty poorly known because we haven't spent as much energy and effort into studying it prior to the last 10, 15 years, in my opinion. There's been focus a lot in like Southeast Asia on dengue, for instance, versus some of these particular viruses. And you still see that in terms of the monetary investment for surveillance and for studying viruses, that there's still very much focus on these larger diseases that people know about more, like dengue, and not so much about all of these other viruses that have high transmission rates and high mortalities in some cases. And a lot of this bat natural reservoir issue has to do with the fact that bats have physiologies that are different from ours, and it allows for some level of viral tolerance. And so if you look at this diagram and you look on the right, that's the human pathway for how we have an immune response. And it's very much with bats because of their ability to fly. And so when you are flying, you are energetically using a lot from your body. And so you have free floating DNA in your body. And because of that, the bats just have like a very dampened response so that they don't have to actually constantly send out something that will trigger an immune response and spend all that energy. Like if you look at people, you'll see on the right that in the diagram, the IFN beta at the bottom, there's a lot of them coming out. That's part of the immune response, and that's really energetically expensive to keep doing. Because the bats themselves already have lost this amino acid that would create a sting response that is that particularly strong, then they will actually save energy. So it's easier for them to just kind of live with the viruses kind of in their bodies. Viruses are, a lot of them are like free-floating DNA just in your system, right? And so these bats have found ways, this is one particular pathway that allow them to then tolerate having those viruses. And this is not like by all means like the only pathway. This is just one that we know well because we've studied it. And even so, that study only happened about 2 years ago. And so there's a lot about bat physiology that is not well known, and it doesn't allow us to then like pre-predict how certain viruses might be reacting in a bat's anatomy just because we haven't spent the time to really study it. So the viruses aren't completely eliminated, which is why they have them. And I've also worked with folks for filoviruses, which include Marburg, Ebola, and the non-symptomatic restin, where it's also another type of receptor entry, facilitated infection. So normally you'll have a receptor and it fits, and that's how this particular virus is able to get into your body. With filoviruses and mammals, they need this thing called MPC1. And with bats, we see that they have a slightly different shape in theirs, and so it can't actually infect them. So if you look at the graphs I have on top that shows that the bat, which is the purple one on the left graph, they are not actually being infected in the same way as the green monkey cell lines, the primate cell lines. And then when they replaced the bat ones with the green monkey ones, you actually see that infection going up instead. And so there is clearly something physiologically about how the bats have their MPC1 and how they are reacting, or not reacting in this case, to having the viruses in them. It's unable to go into it. And that's really relevant to our current conversation with COVID, because for COVID, you see that you need that ACE2 receptor, and it's actually very much tied to how SARS-CoV-2 is able to get into the cell. And so understanding more about receptor, like host factor receptors, and how hosts are actually physiologically connected to the virus helps us be able to then figure out solutions that would address these particular problems at the receptor site, instead of like just only dealing with downstream effects. So a lot of what people see right now, for instance, with therapeutics, often deal with the result of having had the infection happen already, whereas we do need to understand more about the steps that lead to infection in order to help us also find solutions. And then I just want to talk a little bit about how COVID is like their natural history and what we do know of it. And it's just to kind of clarify to a lot of people what is actually going on. So recently, there has obviously been a lot of work on the evolution of COVID, because we really need to know what the origin is of the virus so that we can actually figure out who the natural reservoir host is and figure out what to do. And in this case, COVID was caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. What we do know is that it is a cousin to the SARS-CoV, which we've had in 2002, 2003 in East Asia, which caused SARS. And if you kind of zoom in on the part where we have SARS-CoV-2 here, we can see that the little bat icon over here is SARS-CoV-2, and that's a human one, and that divergence is about 40 to 70 years ago. And so if it were something that were a very recent infection, you would expect that to be much, much closer to the current time, so that branch wouldn't be as long. And these analyses are only based on available data, so there's obviously big gaps in it, right? So it really highlights somewhat like the lack of understanding of viruses in the environment. And that's why people are spending so much effort now to go out and try to capture that particular diversity to better understand how bats and humans have different strains of SARS-CoV-2 and how they're related. And it kind of suggests that there probably should be an intermediary, because if the divergence time is so long ago, then it probably means that that particular bat with the highest percentage matching genetic SARS-CoV-2 couldn't have directly spread it to humans. And that is different from when there's now another hypothesis about how it can spread directly, which is that you just need to have the cleavage site that is necessary for infection. And so with coronaviruses, this particular bat species, which is now a different horseshoe bat, they are not as phylogenetically similar as the one that we saw previously on that tree, but it has an insertion in the same spot here, this spot over here, where it can then actually go into a human cell and actually be able to infect it. And it shows a pattern of natural recombination that basically says, like, you don't need an intermediary or host, then you can just have the bat transfer it directly to people. And that adaptive structural change is something that happened for only this species and not for any other ones that we found so far. But we don't actually know how common this is with bat species, because we haven't actually looked into this very much. And so that cleavage site this is like the first one we found, and this is from, I think this is from about a few months ago. You know, it's pretty recent. And so that type of understanding is something that if we had that before the pandemic happened, then we might have a better sense of, oh, these are the different ways in which pathogens can infect humans, and this is what we should be looking for in nature, and we're trying to study it and get a better sense of it. But it also points to us that, okay, if it is that this is the only thing that's required to infect it, then you might have a host that is not necessarily phylogenetically similar as a reservoir host. And we know, though, from the general collected data, this is from Nextstrain, which takes all the data in from the world. And this is one of the more recent screenshots I have of their tree. You can see that the origin is from Asia. It's that blue part down here. And then it spreads into Europe and then to North America and so on. And there's some back spreading in some cases too. And that makes sense with what we know from what we see in the news and what we see in the data already. And that human to human contact is really important for the spread of COVID. So our antivirals and our therapeutics will help stop the severe symptoms, but in order to stop the spread of COVID, you actually do still need that vaccine. Like, everybody recently has been talking about this whole herd immunity thing, but herd immunity isn't really achievable unless you have a vaccine. Because unless you're okay with a lot of people dying, then that's just not how herd immunity works. Like, you would have to have a population that is able to somehow be immune to it from exposure. And because of that, you know, we do need to spend more effort into making a vaccine that's safe and not just like rushing one out, so that we can ensure that people are protected from it. And testing is really important. It allows us to actually monitor where there are contact transmissions happening. It allows you to then trace the spread of the virus that way. And that way helps you decide where you actually need to concentrate your efforts to quarantine people and to figure out where the infected patients are, and really spend your resources in places where it'll have a high impact, and not just, you know, use all our resources and spread it out everywhere, and in some cases to people who may not be as high risk or highly infected. And so it causes a lot of these negative sentiments in the population about different control efforts. And, you know, especially because I'm in the US, like, we see this a lot. It's like people don't really fully appreciate that this might be affecting people at a different rate because the spread has been very much geographically disparate. So, you know, these are just kind of things that I want to make sure that everybody is aware of as to why people keep saying these things. It's very much part of our ability to fight and to try to understand the virus better, and then to contain the spread so that fewer people are impacted by it. And just to really hone in on some of these like conspiracy theory-esque things that people keep saying, SARS-CoV-2 is a natural virus. There's not a combination of known viruses as you would expect from like a man-made virus. So if it were man-made, we would have to take our understanding of viruses and put them together to make a virus and then have it like go infect something. And we don't see that. Like, there's clearly no evidence of that from what we have found in our phylogenies of SARS-CoV, which is, like I said before, the earlier SARS from 2003, and what we do know of our current SARS-CoV-2, and they don't share any branches. So it's pretty clear that if we were to make a coronavirus, and this is our closest cousin to the current one, like, it should have had some similarity. People keep pointing to the fact that like fast rates of evolution aren't natural, which is not true. You can have really strong purifying selection, and you can have frequent recombination, which is what we saw with the case where there was that insertion where they can just take pieces from, you know, different types of animals they might be exposed to, which is why pangolins keep also coming up, and then they can then just recombine naturally and not have to, like, you know, have some lab do it or whatever people are saying and how they do it. The reason why we have to think about recombination as a major factor in this is that we know coronaviruses are actually very much capable of recombining. And so this isn't unheard of for the family that it belongs to. And when you have really strong purifying selection, you can, in a couple of generations, have things that will be strongly favorable to that organism, in this case, the virus, in order to be able to infect or transmit or do whatever it needs to do as an organism. A good example of this for other animals would be, if we had rats in New York City and somebody were going out there and putting rat poison, and then the rat developed some sort of, like one rat develops the ability to fight against that, then that rat won't die, and we'll still have 20 babies, and all of them have that particular type of protection, whereas the other rats would die, and so that replaces it in the population. And so you have the ones that are more capable of surviving in that situation. The fruiting cleavage site is naturally found in other bats. It's not man-made, which is what people are claiming. If you look at the little box I have in the corner there, that's HKU9 is actually one of the strains from the previous coronavirus that we know from SARS, and then the CoV-2 is on the bottom. And we see that it's found even in those, and we have just another insertion here. So these are the same. And so the RNA copy choice errors that are really common to those places are something that we know from even just doing genetics. So, whenever you have repeat sites, then the copying can make slight mistakes because of that. And you can see that with a lot of this other reservoir hosts that are relevant, you'll have that overlapping range also. So it's not unheard of that they have something similar because they might recombine, they might have shared something evolutionarily. And so a lot of the evidence points to the fact that SARS-CoV-2 is a natural virus. It's not just like one line of evidence. There are multiple lines that tell us that. And it's just understanding evolution in order to really appreciate that. And there's tons of other sources, and everybody can take a screenshot if they want to. These are just papers that have come out recently, but there's another paper that actually got published in a preprint last week that's about the receptor sites for SARS-CoV-2 that I didn't want to put into this until it gets into like fully reviewed papers, but I suggest that people keep an eye out for that in the next couple of weeks. And Andy Rambo actually updates a lot on his Twitter and on Virological with these phylogenetic updates if anybody is interested. So another thing that people do a lot is that their gut reaction is to say, well, if this animal has it, then let's just kill the animal to decrease disease risk. And that's just not what you want to do. It's going to cause the opposite thing of what you want to happen. Culling does not decrease disease risk because we know that when you're limiting local spillover, it doesn't actually impact the regional persistence of the virus. So in Peru, and this was some time ago now, they actually went out and they were killing vampire bats because they were afraid of them spreading rabies to the livestock. And what happened is you end up killing them in that central population, but bats from other populations would come in and replace the bats that you have in where you culled them. And so what happens is you're increasing the movement of these animals in the landscape, which actually means that you're increasing viral transmission. They could be bringing in different strains of rabies. It could be then helping with just bringing in what's left over in that population to other places that they're still flying between. And you end up actually increasing the disease risk because of that higher level of transmission dispersal. And so you're not going to get the intended effect of reducing disease risk just because you went out and culled these animals in this one place. And a lot of these threats that bats face are doing the same thing, where it's creating new interfaces for transmission. So with hunting, with agriculture, with mining, with urbanization, persecution, climate change, mismanaged ecotourism and disease, like a lot of these things are unnatural interfaces between humans and bats that would not have existed until we went in there and did something. And those can be direct, like hunting, or it can be indirect, like land use change. And so we have to actually concentrate our efforts in figuring out how to mitigate these problems in order to stop the next pandemic. Like conservation is very much tied together with what we see in terms of transmission risk. And we know that, this is important because everything doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like human encroachment, threatening bat species is a huge problem worldwide. So like mature forests being turned into farms, they lose roosting sites. And so the bats have to roost in buildings that are closer to people. We know that there have been ecological studies that show that there are huge crashes in bat populations. And so we already are losing the wider breadth of bats that might have, clues for us about how we can understand the natural occurrence of the virus in nature. We know that they have bats that are also being depleted from places because of things like shrimp farming, and it's another rapid cause of loss for the bats that I study, especially for flying foxes, because mangroves are a very small percentage of the environment, but it actually is really important to not only terrestrial wildlife, but also to marine wildlife, because they are the places where there are also nurseries for a lot of reef fish, and are a lot of the places that people depend on also for water purification if you live near the coast. And like for hunting, you know, in places like where I work in Indonesia and in the Philippines, people hunt them for all kinds of different reasons. On the left, that cage is from Sumatra, and people eat them as obat, which is medicine. They believe that the bats are able to cure asthma if you eat the liver, and that has like no basis in any science. And the reason why they say the liver is because they believe that that's the central part of the body and not like the heart or something else. And so if they eat it, then they're supposed to be able to cure their asthma. And then if you ask them like why they eat the bats as like meat, sometimes people will tell you, oh, the bats are going out into the forest and they're eating fruits, and the fruits are healthy. So if we eat the bats, then we're healthy. And, you know, if you ask them like, why don't you just eat the fruit directly? Then they're kind of like, oh, you know, we can't really get the fruit. And so they kind of make a lot of these reasonings as to why they eat the bat instead. And in some cases, eating those bats is to the point where it's unsustainable. So on the top right there, that is a picture from the markets in northern Sulawesi, which is where a lot of those pictures that people find on the internet for, you know, lots of bats in piles and in sticks and stuff like that are from this particular area, because the people there are eating them as a cultural thing. It is for them a marker of the fact that they are not Muslim, because Muslims wouldn't eat wild meat because it's not halal. And so they are Christian, and it's one of their ways that they differentiate themselves with Muslims. But if you really talk to people and you ask them like why they eat them, it's something that's like inherited from their grandparents. It's something that's inherited from the community. And so it's pretty clear that it's like a learned community value, and it's not something that is necessarily used now as a way to delineate their cultural differences from other people in the wider groups in other parts of Sulawesi. So you can work with them to build these solutions that will then target younger generation and have them be a conduit for you to work towards getting the older generation to stop eating them. And at the same time, because it's related to religion, you can work a lot with people who are church elders, who can then help create quotas and stop people from eating as many bats also in the meantime, in order to decrease that consumption rate. And in some places, like in the bottom right there, that's a photo from Papua New Guinea, where people have lower levels of food security. And so they hunt bats because it's one of the largest protein sources in nature near them. And so in those cases, people are not hunting them at that same unsustainable rate as you would see in Sulawesi and Indonesia, because there's just not as many people there. And so right now, there's not a lot of people dealing with that issue in PNG, because it's not at a level where we would consider it like a huge, you know, species threatening level threat. But, you know, we do keep an eye on it just in case. But, you know, these are consistently issues and ways in which people are contacting bats, so they would not normally be otherwise. And, you know, working in disease, like right now, all the stuff I'm talking about with conservation is very much tied to disease ecology, because it means you're operating in a system that's not in a vacuum. You know, everything is connected. And that's where, you know, people start talking about this idea of One Health, which is acknowledging that there is interconnectedness between all the factors, like the host and the pathogen are connected. The host is also connected to the environment, and the stressors on the environment can then impact the host, which can then impact the pathogen. And all of these are influencing each other in some way. And so if we want to have fewer public health issues, we actually would need to have healthy bat populations, which can then lead to healthy ecosystems, and then fewer stressors on those natural ecosystems would also be a way to then increase the health of the ecosystem. And that's particularly dealing with the viruses that I'm interested in. In some other cases, there might be other animals that have vector diseases from something like snails, where the opposite is true, where, you know, more development leads to less of the disease existing. But for the most part, when we're talking about these types of infectious diseases, we're talking about having healthier ecosystems and fewer ways in which bats and humans have contact that would otherwise not exist. And for me as an evolutionary biologist, I'm really interested in thinking about coevolution. So a lot of the studies that happen right now often focus only on the pathogen, and it doesn't actually study the host very much. But there are a lot of dynamics in terms of understanding the host and virus diversity and how we can predict things. So if you know where your host origins and hotspots are, you can presume that there's also some biodiversity hotspot there, and we don't actually know enough about where we're finding some of these hosts as their historical origins. And so we need to do more research on the host before we can do that. And we don't have that basis because we don't have evolutionary trees for all the different bat species that are involved. If we wanted to study something like spillover, we would need to know what are the closest related taxa. For a lot of the existing theory, it's that usually if you are more closely related, it's more easy for a pathogen to jump between the hosts. And so that supposition we can only test if we knew which bats are more closely related. And again, we don't have phylogenies for a lot of these species, so we don't know. There might be clade-specific physiological responses. So like I mentioned with NPC1 and with flying foxes, we know that for our receptor, it just can't actually infect. Are those similar responses in other bats or in other types of viruses and how bats interact with them? And also just like ecologically, we don't know a lot. So like bat roosting ecology and how it affects viral transmission or diversity, that we could only predict if we knew more information about the bat's roosting ecology at all. Like right now, sometimes all we know about a bat's roosting ecology is that their roost is there. And sometimes in some months they're not there, and that's it. Like we have no idea where they go in the months where we don't see them. We have no idea if they are connecting with other bat roosts to form like larger roosts during like mating season. In some cases, some bat species are only known from specimens in collections and have not been seen in nature for some time, or they are solitary species instead of colonial species, and so they're really hard to track in nature. And so we don't even know where they're roosting normally because of that. So there's all these like open-ended questions because we actually don't understand these really basic things about bats, and it really harms our ability to actually address these global challenges. So what we can do though is fill these knowledge gaps. It's necessary for us to make better models. It's better for making preventative strategies. We have better models, and then we can make better policy because we know what we're trying to actually address. Like we can triage our money to the places where it will have the most benefit for bats and for humans. And again, just really stressing this point, like reducing human wildlife contact reduces transmission risk. And that's true not just in this case, but with a lot of other pathogens. So, when people talk about like rabies in wild populations, it might be also just decreasing human contact with those can be a way to reduce the ability for that to be transmitted. And just spending more time and effort on preventative surveillance. It's cheaper than containment. It helps us understand things like what is the normal background that we see for viral diversity in the environment. And so we can understand that if there is actually a spike or not in certain seasons. And then during those certain seasons, if there is a spike, then we spend more effort in trying to decrease the amount of contact between humans and intermediary hosts and bats and other natural reservoir hosts. And just to really hone in that, this is something that's cheaper to do before than after. This is the economic impact of infectious diseases that was known up until about this point. And if you look at these numbers, like SARS was 30 to 50 billion. And if you look at the amount of money that we could be spending on research in order to up our ability to address it, it's somewhere between 2 to 3 billion. So it's like 10 times more money to try to contain something instead of addressing it beforehand and trying to put, more effort to it before the problem happens. And for us, we can also on the governance side improve things like the scientific capabilities in places where there are a lot of sources of infectious pathogens, or if there are wildlife crime issues there, so that you can decrease that contact between humans and wildlife again. And that can come in the case of, they can get better machinery that will help them be able to address questions that they couldn't otherwise, or it can be in specialized training, like on the bottom left there. That's when we did some marine CSI training with some of the Coast Guard and folks in Malaysia that have to deal with marine crime. And that in particular picture is this giant fake loggerhead turtle that we made that is stuffed with like 300 wet towels. And so it weighs about 500 pounds, and they have to somehow drag it into the body bag that is meant for collecting things in the ocean. And that's not something that they would normally have access and practice with, because they just actually don't have access to this very particular loggerhead that was made for this workshop, but also just even the body bags themselves. People have only access to the ones that are for land where there's no mesh, and so the water would have collected versus going through the mesh in our workshop, and then being able to actually collect evidence. And if you talk to some of these people, they'll tell you things like, Oh yeah, when we have to collect evidence, we just hold it and we just swim back to the surface with it, and that's it. And you're like, what happens if you drop something? They're like, it's just gone. And so, that's all you can do. And so, these little things that we can do to help other places that are not as, well equipped is a way to also help them be able to help us stop pandemics and the spread and transmission. And in some cases, in order to actually do that, means that we have to actually change legal capacity and political will, and to increase the understanding that environmental crime is a serious issue. A lot of places treat green crime as if it's like a low-level issue, and so they don't really have really high punishments for them. It's something like 3 months in jail in Indonesia for if you were caught selling songbirds that are protected, for instance. And if you have people crossing a lot of these international boundaries, it means that you actually have to have more multilateral and multi-stakeholder collaborations in order to catch these wildlife poachers. And it doesn't stop just at that country. And so it requires us to go out and really form relationships with other governments in order to encourage that. And so I want to kind of make sure that people understand that it's not just like a single thing that I'm talking about. We have to value biodiversity in the long term. And if we're valuing biodiversity only in these short-term ways, we will not be able to really understand what's happening when people are saying like, oh, I'm selling off this parrot, I'm selling off this tiger bone. Like, people look at that number and say, oh, it's just a smallish number, it's a couple $1,000s. I mean, it's not, because like the value of those illegal body parts are increasing every single year. If you look at the bottom where I put the rhino horn, it's 60,000, and that's up 9,000% since 2007, which is like a decade ago. And if you look at the prices for all of these animals, it's increasing at this exponential rate in some cases because the rarity is increasing. And if you really then look at these animals as contributors to ecosystem services, they are individually worth millions and millions of dollars. Like I said before with durian and bats, bats are contributing to that, and every bat that dies isn't contributing to that. So you have these downstream effects to the economy that might be happening that you're not able to predict because you're removing animals from the natural system, and we don't have any data to show what's going to happen. And we don't have any understanding of the problems we might be causing because of the fact that we're removing them from nature. And so we have to think about the long term and not just the immediate, get a couple $1,000s for something. And for us, we don't really think about wildlife crime as a huge issue, but when you really look at the value, like I mentioned before, it's at least $7 billion to possibly even $23 billion. And because it's a black market trade, it's really hard to get an exact number. But because the punishment for these crimes are so low, it actually makes wildlife trafficking the most lucrative crime in the world, because your punishments are just so lax. Like, you can kill an elephant in some countries, and instead of being fined a really large number, you just go to jail for a few months, and then you pay like a couple $1,000s as a fine, and that's it. So there are these really low levels of punishments that are considered basically the cost of doing business to poachers, and they're willing to pay that because they can, as long as they can get a large shipment, they can get away with it, then it's worth it to them. And also, we should just support a lot of these community conservation and outreach efforts, because a lot of these ways are how we can then reach the public who might not be aware of what's happening and get them to support protecting those species in situ, in where they're from. So this is a study that my Indonesian student Scheherazade Sarah has been doing in Sulawesi, where we knew that people love durian. So the way that we reached out to them was honing in on that love for durian to hook them into bat conservation. And because of that, we were able to then get them to also do other things related to outreach that helped other environmental issues, like reducing trash on the beaches, and also promoting literacy and getting resources to students who are in these really remote places where they can't get access to other scientific educational resources. And so you can have impacts downstream that are not necessarily just the scientific ones that you intended, but also other developmental benefits, and at the same time, like, build trust between yourself and the local population, local community, in a way that lets you have long-term and effective measures to try to fight this kind of issue. And when we were able to build that trust, then we can actually ask the village elder to make a law that says that hunting is illegal, and then they put a sign up and everything, and he like goes out and make sure people are not doing it. They have a patrol that goes out every week, and they're able to then also monitor the population to make sure it's recovering, because now they're protecting it. And that worked really well, to the point where now there's a regional level agreement that was signed that was protecting them. And so you can basically slowly increase the influence of your work by building that trust over time in these different places. And it's not really about like how long you work with them, but actually just the amount of trust you build with them. Because I know there are people who worked in some places for like 5-10 years and they still struggle with being able to build that type of outcome. Whereas we've worked with these folks for about 3 or 4 years now, and we were able to get the agreement for them to sign it like 2 years ago. So it's really that quality of time that you spend with them more than the quantity. And I just want to thank all the people that made all the research possible. All of that is a lot of work that's happened over the last like 10 years in some cases. And I would like to thank everybody for having me. And if you would like to contact me, please feel free to email me or DM me on Twitter or whatever.
Thank you, Susanna. It was really amazing talk. Like so interesting, all those aspects. Really true what you said about those viruses being neglected. Because they were the focus is on something else, and I feel like it's a general. Sorry, my dog is snoring. I feel like it's been a general infectious diseases issue. Like this is all about hype in general. Like you can see when there was this huge Zika thing, like all the research funding was on that, such as is the case for SARS-CoV-2. And there are just so many other things. Like it blows my mind that Tangiasis isn't on the official neglected tropical diseases list. It's crazy. Like the impact it has here or in South America, I just don't understand.
And if you even look at how that NIH funding works, NIH can form relationships with the Infectious Disease Institute to other government agencies, not just in NIH, but like in NSF or DOD or whatever. And because there hasn't been that much focus on infectious disease, they haven't really formed as many relationships as could be possible. And they're only doing it now as a way to respond to coronavirus. And so it makes it slower for us to respond if we don't already have those relationships in place. And it's obviously even worse for us on the American side, because now we are pulling out of WHO for some reason. So yeah, there's a lot of these political things that happen that influence our ability to actually address a virus. And it's like, I think the last 6 months has been all of us seeing all this money that was scattered in different parts of the government all become concentrated into like the 1 or 2 agencies that deal with infectious diseases. But to be able to get that money from one agency to another also takes time. So like that also is another thing that slows it down. And yeah, it's a really, really big issue. It's not just like within the agencies that do deal with it.
And it's funny what you said about like people eating bat, saying that they eat bat because they think that bat are healthy and they would be healthy. Because I remember having this talk with a woman that works with gorilla and chimpanzee in the RSC, and she had the same question for the locals, and they said the exact same thing. So she had like two groups. Those who said like, oh no, we can't eat monkeys because they look like us too much and it would be a bit disturbing. And then she asked them like, yeah, but do you realize that they could give you diseases at some point? It's like, no, like they just in the forest, like sometimes they do eat meat, but like what can be wrong in the forest? They just have a healthy lifestyle, so of course they like the healthiest thing you can get.
And we've seen people also try to study bats, and like people who are proponents of eating them, they'll try to study them and say like, oh, there's all these health benefits from eating them, and you're like, this is based on like no science at all. It's just like arm wavy. You just have to like write responses to them in Indonesian that are like, this is not true, please do not believe this, and this happens at least once a year. So it's a consistent issue for us, and we often have to like remind people that there is no science that supports this.
Have you felt like, so people, I'm talking there, I'm starting with a question, but if you have questions, just put them in the chat while I'm worried, I'm starting. But have you felt like it had been it's been more difficult the last few months to do bat conservation because of global perception of bats now?
Yeah, I think it's been more difficult, especially in the first few months when people were making a lot of misconceptions become like fact and policy because of that. And now that we've had some time where we can like reach out to different groups and reach out to all of our different people in different regions to actually contact their governments and talk to them, it's been a little bit better. I know every single bat scientist has been contacted by like every single person to talk about bats, because like we want to be able to tell people, that's not what is actually happening. We actually have to understand what's happening with the bats, and they might actually be the key for us to get out of this problem. But not every bat biologist feels really comfortable with talking about those issues because of the fact that the research for EIDs from bats are really new. So like I said, some of these things only came up in the past 2 years, and it's really hard for some people to keep up with that research and know how it's relevant to the current issue. And so you end up having an already small group of researchers. There's not a ton of bat researchers compared to other organisms. And then out of that small group, you have a smaller percentage even that are comfortable with communicating about pathogens and about conservation and about how that links to COVID. And so right now, one thing that we're doing, and this is part of the GBATnet initiative that I'm a part of also, is bringing together all these experts from the different networks globally and different disciplines that are global, and actually have us share information with one another about each other's research and each other's results in a way that other people can then communicate that. And so we have a blog that's set up for GBATnet that has little articles that explain all the research that has been done, which includes some of the stuff that I covered here. And we have articles that will go up every so often also about like other things like climate change and other issues that impact bats and like how people can live with them safely. So there are resources that we've started to put out there for the public, but also as a way to talk to each other about what we have already in our hand, like what we know, so that we can help other people understand it better. And it's not like a black box, like some people think it is, because there is a lot of research coming out right now, and it is really difficult to keep up with, because I think every day there's at least 2 or 3 preprints that come out that are about that, bats and SARS in some way, and bats and SARS-CoV-2. And we don't have enough time always to read all of that work, obviously. So you would need somebody who you trust as like, okay, you understand this. Can you tell me what actually happened in this paper? And if I should think that it's actually relevant to the conversation and it's good science. So yeah, we're making inroads on that right now, but it has been somewhat difficult. I know there's been people who are working in places where our physical presence on the ground is actually really important for like patrolling and stopping people from killing bats at roosts and things like that. And this is true even for other wildlife that needs to be protected that way. And it's been challenging because we can't be there to make sure that those populations are protected. And in some countries where the rules are very lax, it has led to an increase in poaching instead of a decrease, just because people aren't out there. So yeah, it depends on where you are in the world and how much proximity you have to bats. And I think that for people that are in these kind of more developed and urban areas, there are more resources that are available like right there. So, like in the US, in the UK, there are bat conservation groups that are local that can like go out and still do activities or still do virtual activities with their neighbors in order to encourage certain actions that will protect bats. But we don't have the same thing in other countries, and there might be no access to internet that's consistent. So you can't do virtual meetings. You really do need to have that face-to-face. So it makes it challenging to stop those issues in places that have high biodiversity and high bat diversity, especially. So yeah, it's been kind of challenging. We're doing the best we can given the resources we have and given the limitations that we have.
Yeah, and so we've seen the darkest things at the beginning of the pandemic with people like the racism that we've seen towards Asian people and people of Asian descent because of all those stereotypes about eating bats and everything. And do you think people have felt the need of doing some cultural awareness things and like have been pushed to do that in order to like make things normal again? Or
so I think that's unfortunately, because of the fact that the field of EEB is really not very diverse in general, it's very white male dominated. There has been a lot of issues that would have been better addressed by somebody who is from those communities, and it hasn't been able to be addressed because of that. And so like there hasn't even been that much attention on it because of the fact that there are so few people impacted by it. But like I am directly impacted by it, like when I go out into the street, right? So it's something that I don't think that people have really thought very much about, because people are so focused only on what happens in their home turf, like in the issues that are right around them. that for me as a person who is Asian and like has to deal with this on the occasion when I go out, it it makes it feel kind of like I'm one of the only people who is even like thinking about it, and I've not heard anybody who is in my own field that like will like offer a helping hand for that. So I can't really, I don't feel like I can depend on other people to help me with that too, right? And so it does feel kind of like isolating. And oftentimes for me, it's partially because of that I just focus on working with my students, you know, in Indonesia and the Philippines, even from here, as a way to not have these cultural problems arise as much. Just because like there is a critical need for work in those places, and it's a better use of my time to try to concentrate on them instead of like fighting a tidal wave that, you know, is going to impact me only if I put myself in those situations. So I think it really depends on who you talk to, and there's not enough Asian bat biologists where that is like coming out enough, unfortunately. And I'm hoping that from us creating the GBATnet, we're able to then bolster scientists who are coming from these different groups, and then bolstering their voices and bolstering their ability to then pass on that message and increase contact with people from different backgrounds to encourage that. And I know there's a lot of scientists who also have formed a global South kind of network, and they've done workshops where it's folks from Latin America are going to Africa and vice versa in order to learn from each other, in order to understand their biodiversity together and share resources also. So there are some initiatives in place from people that have recognized this as an issue. It hasn't fully spread to East Asia in the way that I would want to, but there is right now a East Asia bat network that's being formulated, and it's kind of in like its early stages right now, so it's not formalized, but it will come into fruition, I think, within the next year and be part of the GBATnet network. And hopefully from that, we can see addressing these issues more directly with folks who are from those places.
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry and sad to hear that. I was actually talking about the general public. It actually never crossed my mind that in the academic like field or whatever field you are working in, this wouldn't be addressed, and that nobody would have felt that it was right to talk to you about it. It's actually so wrong. Because I think even the general public can feel it. Something as stupid as, so I was in France just before that. So I was there in like late January and early February. And I remember going to a Chinese restaurant with a friend, and it was just a very popular one. We were just the only one there, and the owner was just saying like, since this whole thing started, people just don't want to come. And
yeah,
it's been like that for the whole beginning of the pandemic. I don't know how it is now because I'm here in Kenya. But yeah, I don't think it's possible to ignore it. So I think people just choose to ignore it, but I would never imagine that like nobody among your colleagues had reached out to you about that, because it was abuse. It was everywhere on social media, and it was very violent.
Yeah, and I think at most the only conversations we really had were the incorrect use of the term wet market to call the initial market where things happen. It was a wildlife market, and like having to explain that and like the racist connotations in which it was being used was the closest we ever had in terms of like a conversation about being more sensitive to certain words in race in relation to like Asian Americans and Asians in general, and these cultural misunderstandings. So I think like once that was kind of cleared up, like people have stopped asking me about things like that, because I will just correct all of them like in their writing. If they write wet market when they mean wildlife market or some other market, like I'll just correct it, and I'll write like a paragraph explainer in the comment with like a link to different places. I'm just like, other people have written even more about it, you should read up in this here, because it's just like after a while you're like, okay, there are resources on the internet you should have found already that talked about this, that it should have just come from me.
Just mean that you just don't see it.
Yeah, so I think that was like the first couple months, right, when COVID happened, and then there's been no other real conversations since then. And at most, I know that in the last few months, there are a lot of people who are Asian American, who have come out more with their stories about being harassed in the street and things like that. But it's not something that's consistent in the scientific community, because there are so few people that are not white that have to deal with these issues like face to face on a daily basis when they go out. And that's true to some extent even like outside, right? When you consider how a lot of people who are Asian American are being targeted by, you know, hate crimes basically right now, like people don't always report them. And if you're in a city where you don't normally expect to see it, it feels more jarring. But if you have lived in those cities for a long time, you know, there's always like that small percentage of people that are jackasses about race. And so, you know, you're going to run into somebody like that. And like I've seen it in New York already with some lady was like yelling at like a very old Chinese man, and like a bunch of us had to just like get her to go away, you know, because like at least in those cities, you know, you might have more allies than in places where you are just like completely alone and don't have people who are the same race as you to help defend you, or like you don't have allies in any other ways. So I know it's more difficult for folks who are in a situation where they don't have anyone to depend on around them. And so they might feel more fear because of that. And they've stayed at home a lot because of that. They've, you know, done more things to try to protect themselves and separate themselves from that situation. But it's not an option for everybody, right? So you still expose yourself to that on the occasion. And I'm very fortunate that so far, I've only experienced it like twice in the past 6 months. But that's also because there have been occasions where when I go out, you can't really tell that I'm Asian because like I tie my hair up and I have like a hoodie up so that like my hair is hidden and everything. And, you know, it's difficult to figure out that I am Asian American then. And on top of that, I live in a neighborhood in Maryland, which is like extremely politically progressive and extremely diverse. And so I don't have problems getting groceries here. But then when I was in New York for a little bit, there was like some lady on the street that yelled at me. And there was also some lady that came up to me once when I was waiting at a bus station, and she like just came up to me and pointed in my face, like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "What are you talking about? I'm waiting for the bus." And then she like yelled at me for 2 minutes about spreading diseases or something like that. And then everybody else at this bus station looked at her and told her to shut up. So, you know, it just depends on where you are. And for me, at least, I know I'm in a situation where I'm going to experience less of that than other people. So I have not complained about it as much as some other people, but I know it is happening to a lot of folks that I'm friends with. And it does feel really isolating for some of them. And it's compounded by the fact that, you know, a lot of us have other political issues going on at home. Like I'm from Hong Kong originally. So like my concentration in terms of effort in like political things is more like over there, along with the BLM stuff that's happening like in DC. So my attention towards just like specific Asian American, you know, racism happening right now is a little bit like it's a lower priority compared to some other political issues I'm dealing with. So yeah, it doesn't come to mind as much now because of that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, that is just so sad. Just to get back to your talk, so this marine crime CSI workshop that was conducted, so this was organized through your consultancy, right?
So that was back when I was working with Fish and Wildlife, and I was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, and I was running the program. And so this is one of the workshops that we did in collaboration with the Malaysian government. And we also did it in Indonesia. So in that case, we worked with the Indonesian government, and we invited folks from any sort of law enforcement agency that had to deal with wildlife crime. And that would be people who are like in the Coast Guard, but also people who might be the rangers of different parks, because they would be the sort of first responders whenever there is a crime where evidence needs to be collected. And marine crime is really different from terrestrial crime because you have an environment that is dynamic and changing. So you actually need to respond to it a lot quicker if you want to collect evidence before it washes away. And that's not something that people learn like regularly in any sort of police training, because, you know, normally you're not trying to think of like, how do I write underwater, or how do I, you know, collect something without collecting a bunch of extra water also, or how do I not drop something? There's a lot of tools that we have taught them that are not like you have to buy it as an expensive kit, but you can make it from something that's really cheap and still use it and be effective as a first responder. And I actually think that particular workshop was very successful, and people were very receptive to what we had to say, and they wanted us to come back and go and do it again also. So yeah, I think right now it's going pretty okay, and I think they're doing it in the Philippines also. So the places that are these key areas and source countries are now getting access to these particular skills and having more people in their law enforcement able to address those particular crimes and actually care about it more.
I actually no idea that these things existed. I find it very, very cool. So,
It's something that most people don't think about, because I think when I started working with them and they were like, yeah, so there's no existing module for teaching marine crime, so we're just gonna make everything ourselves. And I was like, huh, never thought of that, but that is true. Yeah.
yeah, very cool. Thank you so much, Suzanne. It was so I actually have a comment from our notes. So he didn't have a question. He was just saying that the talk was incredible and that he found it really exhaustive. That some subject were covered. That I really liked it. And yeah, that's very true. It was really an amazing talk. So glad that you managed to give that talk today. Really, really great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And
My pleasure. I think pretty much everyone really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, everyone. If you've been shy and you have a question later, so you have all Susan's contact here. I guess you can just contact her on Twitter or send a more lengthy email, whatever you feel like. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's keep in touch. Bye.
Yeah, bye.